you so much. It's a real privilege for me to be able to speak to this conference. As many of you know, I've had a passion for the unreached people groups of the world for many years and have been involved in it for many years as well. And so what I'm really encouraged that now other generations have taken this work on, that it's going better than ever. I always rejoice when people that I've had involvement to, have seen develop, take things on, and then it goes far further and far better than I've ever done. That's what we should be doing, all of us, as we seek to serve the Lord. So I've been I've been asked to speak on a title, which is quite a long title, Fostering a Sense of Family in Mission Amongst the Unreached. And it's a subject close to my heart, because a family on mission is close to my heart, and reaching the unreached is close to my heart. And so I'm glad to address this quickly. Could I just say that the notes of my talk will be available later. And so if I go fast, don't worry about it. If there's anything worth noting down, you'll get the notes, okay? So firstly, a biblical foundation for what I'm teaching. So firstly, this is how God announced his call to transform the world through the descendants of Abraham, which of course was fulfilled in Christ. But when he called Abraham and announced his plan to transform the world, what he said was, God's call to Abraham was that through your family, that's your descendants, every family on earth will be blessed. That's Genesis 12 verse 3. And later promises to Abraham refer to nations. Every nation will be blessed. But the first call is every family will be blessed. Why? Because God sees the earth and the inhabitants of the world in terms of families, or clans, that word could be used. And so he's saying, through a family, I will bless the families of the earth. And Jesus, when he came, he redefined the new family as well as the renewed Israel. The renewed Israel is composed of every tribe and tongue and nation. The new family is all who do the will of my Father, he said, when he was challenged by his own natural family. Jesus built relationship of friendship with the disciples, even though he was their Lord and teacher. He said, I call you friends. He regarded them as, he talks about him as the least of my brothers, and so on. He talked in family language. Jesus did not introduce an institution, but he introduced a culture low in institutionalism and rituals, except for baptism, Lord's Supper, and the Lord's Prayer, possibly, and very, very low in titles for leaders, but high in multiplication of communities through disciples sent on mission to the world. And it's interesting that those disciples were told to go and make disciples of all nations. How did they do that? They did that by planting communities of families called churches. That's how they worked out discipleship. And because you can't really be discipled properly except in community. And the early church, it says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, that wasn't a book of systematic theology, though that can be helpful today, but it was people they knew and trusted. Paul was a self-disclosing father to churches and to many leaders. When he wrote to Timothy, he said, Timothy, my dear son, not Timothy, junior apostle. To Corinth, I became your father. John, the apostle John, addressed the churches as my children. Paul was thankful for spiritual mothers too. In Romans chapter 16, he speaks about somebody who was a mother to him as well as to her natural son. Timothy, as a young man, was to relate to the churches this way: treat older men as fathers, etc., older women as mothers, and so on. And transparency of lifestyle, what Harvey spoke about as vulnerability, transparency of lifestyle gave credibility to the message Paul preached. He said, we didn't only share the gospel with you, but our own lives as well, he said of him and his team to the church in Thessalonica. In Acts 20, verse 18, he says, you know how I lived among you. And I've tried to follow that pattern, even though I've had a traveling ministry rather than like many of you living in a particular place for a long time. But I wanted to do that. And so whether it was in Russia, also in Turkey, we lived for 3 months so that people, and in Russia, it was 3 months for about 5 years, so that people knew who we were. We can give hospitality. We could be vulnerable. I remember Scylla inviting a number of Russian ladies to the first time she gave hospitality to them in our little flat there. And that she'd done this amazing Russian meal, at least I thought it was. And they spent the time saying, well, didn't have enough salt in this, you didn't do this right, and so on. But it was vulnerability. That's how we wanted to be. And Paul said, you know how I was among you. And the commendation of Timothy was not just that he knew Paul's teaching, though he did, but you know my ways in Christ. You know how we live. That creates family. And so apostolic leadership in the New Testament worked out what was the call on Abraham and formed families to bless other families. They served churches through relationship, not institution, and multiplied ministry in the context of companionship and spiritual parenting. And so that's what they did. That's how it worked. And there were families. There were churches that Paul related to, churches that Peter related to, churches that John related to, that were all like families. And so churches are to be families, but on mission. Apostolic leadership establishes family of churches, but is passionate about mission. Otherwise, relationships which are so important become inward looking and cease to reproduce. Families reproduce, that's what they do. So they're relational, they're strong in relationship, but they reproduce. And so we are to be families on mission. So what does that mean for pioneer church planting amongst the unreached? On the one hand, family and relationship terminology is close culturally to many contexts amongst the unreached. So when you talk about families to bless the families of the world, or as I say, that could be clans, which is a little bit bigger than the extended family, but not as big as a tribe. Many cultures that we're seeking to reach, although this wouldn't apply particularly to the unreached in post-Christian Europe that Harvey was talking about. But often we are reaching people that understand that word. And so we actually need to learn, when we're teaching on this, we need to learn, what does family mean in the culture that we're seeking to bring the gospel to. We need to find out what it means. And then, just like with every cultural issue, we need to see what is biblical, what is a cultural expression of biblical teaching, even if they haven't had the Bible, and what in every culture is contrary to biblical understanding of family and relational language. Jesus had to bring that correction to his own family when he said, when he said that he wants that, that everyone who does the will of my Father is my mother and sister and brother. So he had to correct certain things where the natural family was going to be controlling. But also that means that any coming from the West must discard the cultural baggage attached to the terminology in their own context. because in the West now, family is a popular word. Many companies say join the such and such family, which isn't a family at all. It's just their way of marketing. So we've got to avoid all that sort of thing, but really engage with what it means. Because historically, and in the colonial times that Harvey was talking about, institutionalism and denominationalism, as well as theological differences irrelevant to the context, have been introduced into newly planted churches by missionaries from elsewhere. So I find often found in cultures that haven't had many believers before, then missionaries, because they answer the questions that they in their systematic theology taught them about their own culture, they brought in those questions and theological differences into new situations, which was totally unhelpful and caused division. So we don't want ever to do that. Rather, we need to understand what questions are being asked there, and bring our teaching purely from the Bible relevant to that culture. But that applies to the issue of family as well. Nevertheless, being part of a wider family, outside as well as within the particular culture, was an important New Testament practice. So Paul constantly endeavored to break down barriers between ethnicities, between social classes. You know, you could go to a house church, which would be held in a large house, up to 60, 80, even 120 people in the book of Acts. And you might find rich people listening to slaves teaching them and bringing their gifts. Amazing. Because it was constantly breaking down barriers between people and gave their new converts an all over the world context. When Paul is writing to Colossae, which is a church he'd never visited, but a good friend of his had formed into a family in the same way and taught the same things, Epaphras, Paul says, all over the world, this gospel is bearing fruit. And so we bring an all over the world context of gospel expression and seek to link churches together from different cultures. That helps break down the barriers and foster the sense of international family as well as family within the local church. And so, you know, he was telling stories of different, when he's writing to Corinth, he's telling stories about the churches in Macedonia and so on. He's fostering that sense of togetherness. And so the church planting team must relate in a family way to people they're reaching and to new converts, serving them, not over them, sharing lives genuinely, serving them with their families, with open homes, not see home as a refuge from ministry, which is just not appropriate in many contexts. You know, in many contexts, home is a place where you receive others, whereas in Western contexts, it's often a castle into which you retreat. And so we need to overcome that, because it's important to be vulnerable about our own situation and lives, demonstrate servanthood from the start of the relationship, and so that the new believers feel part of a family, not an us and them mentality. And that's fostered within the church being planted. And that, I know that Zafar was dealing with that in another seminar. So we must also demonstrate to new believers respect for those within the wider family, the family across the nations that are supporting them from elsewhere in whatever Ephesians 4 gifting those people may have, and have them introduced to the converts in a particular culture. It's very, very important. I love to do that when I'm visiting places, meet the unbelievers, meet the new believers, and seek to build family with them. And so visiting, supporting ministry must do that, unless it is unwise for security aspects, for the safety of the believers there. Obviously, we have to be careful with that. And so, but as far as possible, visiting ministry, including those with apostolic gifting, must likewise demonstrate servanthood, not expertise. Even though they may have been invited in to bring wisdom on certain contexts, you can bring wisdom as a servant, not just as somebody who's coming with all the answers. Must share their hearts and lives through stories, just as Paul did when he told stories about what was happening elsewhere in the family. I do that wherever I travel. Wherever I go, I tell stories from other parts of the world that I'm also working in. I don't give details of names. I'm very careful, often don't even mention the country. But I always share stories from around the world to foster a sense of international family, as well as a sense of family where in the new church that's been planted. And so that's important. And it's important, therefore, that we can demonstrate our lifestyle, our way of life, our humility, our willingness to receive as well as give. If you're and you know, you can, if it's not these sort of people listening to this talk, you can tell them. If you have a visiting person supporting whatever Ephesians 4 gifting they're coming in, make sure they don't just spend time with the team they've come with or with a church planting team where they're going, but demonstrate a learning attitude in terms of respect for application of truth, as well as teaching the truth itself. I know some places I go to, I rejoice when I've done some teaching and then somebody from the culture, somebody from the nation I'm visiting, then summarize what I'm saying in a way that can very well relate to the people that in that particular culture. I love that happening, and it often does, and I give complete freedom to that. But as I say, I always use stories from around the world, and often will give cultural applications and examples from other contexts so that we can teach indirectly. That's very, very important in many cultures to teach indirectly, not directly. So I give illustrations from elsewhere, which they then can think, yes, that applies to us, or that doesn't apply to us, but it's interesting. Wonder what does apply to us. And so seek to work that out. Could I also say, if you're working in partnerships, which we encourage, e.g. with, for example, with mission agencies, talk these issues through in terms of values, as well as talking through the other important values of New Testament church within which we will seek to operate. Values of grace, values of the Holy Spirit, values of body ministry, all the things that we believe in, and some of which Harvey spoke about as well. Because our objective is autonomous, indigenous reproduction of culturally relevant churches. So they are autonomous, they govern themselves, they are indigenous, they reproduce, but not churches which are independent or disconnected from the family in other nations. And so whilst you encourage strong fellowship with other groups in the particular nation to help resolve particular local or national issues, but also with the broader family. So follow the principle, of course, that once local eldership is established, then apostolic ministry serves by invitation, and the decision as to whether to continue as part of the international family is that of the local elders, of course. And this means that once the church is established, they can decide whether willingly and voluntarily to continue their relationship with the family of churches that the church planting team has come from. And in my experience, almost all are positive about this. Now my time's gone, but if I just mention what I'll just run through very, very quickly, if I may. Apostolic ministry in particular, in the early stages of reaching a particular culture, should be involved in the church planting, but remember, serves churches through relationship, not institutional or titles, models a lifestyle of some humble servanthood that can be seen by the churches served. Apostolic ministry is not head of a network, but brings spiritual parenting to churches and leaders. Thirdly, apostolic ministry is passionate about mission as well as family relationships. Romans 1 verse 5, we've received grace and apostleship to call all the nations to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. Lays godly foundations in the church as a wise master builder, but in a relational and culturally appropriate way, allowing those in the culture to work out what the foundations mean there. Those foundations that are given, Ephesians chapter 2 says to the God's holy apostles and prophets, chapter 3 rather, but it needs laying dynamically in every church, in every culture, in every generation, and is the basis for church planting. And they are releasing in style, not controlling. As I say, families misunderstood in the world can be controlling. Don't adopt that model of family. So, in conclusion, if we believe that the values of the New Testament church, which we're seeking to implement, are important, then they need to be implemented everywhere, and we should not be afraid of introducing these principles to be worked out in a culturally appropriate way in the groups the people groups that we're reaching. We can do that without imposing the organizational style of the background of the church planting team. And our goal is eventually to raise up apostolic teams of Ephesians 4 ministries within the culture we're reaching, who want, but they, if they're genuinely apostolic, will want to reach out beyond their own culture as well. You understand? We raise up people that want to work cross-culturally as well. And so I hope that's helpful. It's a quick overview. You'll have the notes, and back now. Text. Okay.
Cool. Thank you so much, David, for just brilliant, practical, transferable skills of what it means to have the church be family, and to have that element of people coming in, not feeling like there's an us and them. Just so much in that. Thank you so much, David. Absolutely brilliant.